The following video is sponsored by War Thunder.
To my dearest friends, I am honored to welcome you back once more for today's exploration into the grim darkness of the far future. If we were to look through the vast expanse of our galaxy, we would find untold millions of inhabited worlds, first claimed in some bygone age for the glory of those intrepid explorers who simply sought out a home for their wayward kin. But as the long march of time has ever pushed forward, some planets have become rather prosperous, rising as exemplars to their own specializations. Other worlds, however, have garnered a level of infamy, oftentimes due to the dastardly factions who have proclaimed their infernal dominance over those blasted soils. But there is one world, found in Segmentum Solar, which has become not only one of the greatest of bastions towards humanity, but also as a hotbed to some of the most apocalyptic of wars that the galaxy has ever seen. This, of course, would be none other than of the world of Armageddon. In brief, this is a hive world, home to billions of Imperial citizens who toil and labor away in service to the God Emperor, though perhaps their greatest export would be of the famous regiment, known as the Armageddon Steel Legion. Their legendary stormtroopers were always known for their proficiency in armored warfare, where their mechanized units would ceaselessly advance to crush the enemies of man beneath their iron treads. Though this regiment has famously been deployed throughout the galaxy, in conflicts such as the Cassel Rebellion, or to support the Imperial efforts at the Spinward Front of the Calixis sector, they are certainly best known for their involvement within the three great wars for Armageddon. From each conflict, the planet was brought to the brink of utter destruction. But today, my dearest friends, I believe that it is time for us to look over the First War, wherein which the forces of chaos were almost successful in claiming this world for Khorne. To begin with, we will briefly look over the state of Armageddon before it was desecrated by chaos, and of the stationed forces of the aforementioned Steel Legion. After, we will follow the traitor forces which banded together within the hellscape of the Warp, and of their eventual invasion of this forlorn world. This war, once sparked, only continued to grow, until it reached such a size that it seemed as though the world was certain to be drowned amidst the rushing torrents of the Warp. Once this part of our tale is completed, I will cover the shameful aftermath of the conflict, where the victorious Imperial factions fell into a civil war of such scale that it could very well have blossomed to threaten the very integrity of the Imperium itself. But in any case, there is much for us to discuss, and so I do believe that it is time for us to begin. This is a story of chaos and glory. Yet from the remorseless treatment of the heroic Imperial Guardsmen, it has been almost entirely stricken from all official records. But for now, let us turn our attention to the First War for Armageddon.
Since you're watching this video, I can go out on a limb and say that you're probably collecting a tabletop army, which may or may not include a couple of tanks. And as much as we might try, we unfortunately can't ride our miniature tanks. But that's where the sponsor of today's video, War Thunder, has you covered. This is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game to have ever been made, and somehow it's fully free to play on PC, major consoles, and even on mobile devices. There's never been another game that lets you truly dive into the intense front lines quite like War Thunder. From the meticulous detail on the vehicles, backed by the gorgeously realistic graphics, and brought together by the authentically crafted sound effects, you'll really feel like you've taken control of your favourite war machine. Every time you destroy an enemy vehicle, you'll see exactly how your shot landed, with the X-ray view showing the path of your shell, blasting through the hull to devastate the ammo reserves, weapon systems, or even of the entire crew. Every component of each vehicle has been fully modelled, so you'll know if the thick armour panels on your M1 Abrams can withstand a direct shot from a Panzer. You can pick from over 2,500 vehicles, ranging from battle tanks to armoured cars to biplanes to jet fighters to helicopters and even to warships. This full roster is taken from 10 major nations, showcasing their finest creations from the 1920s all the way up to the vehicles of the modern day. Whether you want to do battle in a fast-paced, brutal match, or in a slower, more realistic campaign, War Thunder has you covered with their arcade, simulator, and realistic modes, so you can choose exactly how you want to play. And now, you can even play on the go. War Thunder is now available on both iOS and Android, so you can experience the exact same immersive gameplay from your mobile devices. So if you're interested in joining in with a worldwide community of over 70 million players, or you'll duke it out in your favourite vehicles for glory, then War Thunder will provide you with a truly unmatched experience. You can download War Thunder today for free on PC, Xbox, PlayStation, or on your mobile device. Signing up with my links on PC or console will set you up with a tremendous bonus package, providing you with multiple premium vehicles, the Eagle of Valor Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account access. This is only available for a limited time, so make sure you don't miss out. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, but for now, let's get back to the lore.
This story begins within Segmentum Solar, around a star system known as Armageddon. Orbiting the blazing star of Tisra, we will find 10 worlds, with some being utterly inhospitable, yet to some capacity all have been harnessed and exploited to best serve the Imperium of man. Naturally, this system has been named after the industrial hive world of Armageddon, which, from its military output, has become one of the most strategically important of planets within the greater Segmentum. But, rather strangely, this planet was not formed around the orbit of Tisra. Instead, for the longest time, Armageddon was known as Ulanor, found within the eponymous Ulanor system. During the early days of the 31st millennium, the Emperor of Mankind, accompanied by the still loyal Primarch Horus Lupercal, and over 100,000 Marines taken from 3 legions, launched the Ulanor Crusade to purge this world of one of the largest orc empires that the galaxy had ever encountered. But over 1,000 years later, once the calamity of the Horus heresy had come to an end, a second orc empire lay claim to this realm, and from their invasion of the Imperium, they sparked the conflict known as the War of the Beast. Billions were killed, and in fact Holy Terror itself was almost brought low by the Greenskin menace, but from the sacrifice of the entirety of the Imperial Fists and from the Salamander's Primarch Vulcan, humanity was ultimately saved and graced with yet another day to still live. In the wake of this devastation, the Lord Commander Maximus Thane ordered for the exterminatus of Ulanor, yet the reigning Fabricator General, known as Kubik, had developed a rather keen interest in the various technologies of the orcs. Not willing to condemn their remains to ash, he secretly used the tools of the Greenskins to teleport the entire planet of Ulanor into a new, secretive orbit around the star of Tisra. This was ultimately to be renamed as Armageddon, and all official records were to be altered, claiming that this world had always resided within the system, and any who spoke out in opposition were to be silently dispatched, lest they reveal the clear insubordination of the Fabricator General. In time, however, most everyone would simply agree that Armageddon had always resided here, and from their compliance, the world was permitted to bloom. The human population levels exploded, necessitating the construction of new hive cities, within which billions of faithful imperial citizens would reside, ever loyal to their crafts and to the wider Imperium. But today, observing this planet from orbit, we would see that it harbors 2 great oceans, named as the Boiling Sea and of the Tempest Ocean. The land is primarily split between 3 continents, with there also being a string of islands, dotted through the expansive seas. The northern region, known as the Fire Wastes, are rather inhospitable to human life. And yet, such are the needs of the Imperium that a hardy population must remain here to mine out the many valuable resources within. The plentiful ores will be shuttled back to the industrial hives, always to be used in the construction of weapons, tanks, and other armaments which are most often provided to the guardsmen of the Armageddon Steel Legion. This is the regiment that was founded to protect the Armageddon system, and though they would eventually grow into some of the finest of orc hunters ever seen, at this point in their history, they were primarily known for their specialization in the art of mechanized war. The hostile grounds of the Fire Wastes would be used to train their recruits, who would ride within Chimera APCs and Lehman Russ battle tanks to rapidly charge through the hellscape, only to form wide defensive lines supported by the deployed squads of guardsmen. Don, in their iconic yellow greatcoats and equipped with heavy gas masks, they would be almost impervious to the harsh environments around them, allowing them to more effectively consolidate their positions before embarking back within their transports and advancing forward once more. This strategy of using adaptable infantry squads, supported by great cadres of armored vehicles, became their true forte. And if the Steel Legion are to be deployed anywhere within the galaxy, then we can be sure that we will see them fully utilizing these mechanized tactics. Beyond this, the deployment of great tank regiments has become synonymous with their armies. Dense lines of basilisks and manticores will lay down deadly salvos of fire, suppressing their enemies and permitting the steel columns of Lehman Russes and Baneblades to push forward, reducing any who they come across into a smouldering, ashy crater. But in any case, life upon Armageddon, though somewhat challenging, continued to thrive. The world blossomed into a true industrial powerhouse. The might of their Steel Legion regiments had become well known to the citizens of the Imperium, and by all accounts, humanity seemed to have forged a truly enviable home upon this stolen world. But as we move into the 41st millennium, the planet would be faced with its greatest trial yet, and as the traitorous powers of the warp turned their gaze to the material realm, the first war for Armageddon would plunge this world into chaos. In the wake of Horus's defeat at the hands of the Emperor, and with the shattering of his nefarious heresy, the surviving traitor forces fled into the nightmare of the warp to lick their wounds and to plot their inevitable return to the galactic scene. Though they had once been entirely united behind that single heretical uprising, since the death of the War Master, they had fallen into a state of infighting, with each champion arrogantly believing that they themselves deserved the gifts of the dark gods, and that all others should fall into a position of servitude. Due to this disarray, in the years following the heresy, most chaotic incursions were launched by rather small warbands who, in their limited strength, could just about threaten a small army or frontier settlement. It would only be in the rare circumstances that a true warlord could arise from the chaos to wrangle the treacherous legions into submission that would pose the galaxy with any true threat. This was notably the case with Abaddon's Black Crusades, which have now left their bloody scar upon reality itself, in the form of the Great Rift. When in the presence of such a formidable champion, the dark scions of chaos will often shed their differences and flock together to form a warband beyond compare. Most often, they will believe that through the coming carnage, that they will be granted with some form of immaterial power, although at times the traitors will simply wish to enact vengeance upon the blasted fools of the Imperium. But In the case of our tale, the warlord who arose was not new to the concept of leadership, as at one point he had stood as the Primarch to the 12th Legion, and his name was Angron. In the wake of the heresy, his legion had been shattered by Khan the Betrayer, with its members falling into disarray, forming hundreds of smaller yet rivaled war bands. But with the return of the Red Angel, these squabbling groups were to come together once more, leading to a war band which hosted over 50,000 of the World Eaters, each pledged to spill imperial blood in the name of their old Primarch. The Berserkers did not truly care as to where their warpath would take them, so long as it would enable them to vent their undying rage. But as their space hulk traveled through the chaos of the warp, it seemed as though their voyage was destined to lead them directly towards the imperial world of Armageddon. Though it would still take them several weeks to reach the planet, in the days preceding their invasion, it seemed as though the powers of the warp had already come to leave a foul impact upon the poor denizens of this world. Armageddon was swept by an unprecedented wave of madness, launched by isolated sects and cults who had seemingly appeared overnight within the most vulnerable and forgotten of regions. Hive cities were forced to fend off sudden rebellious movements, industrial zones were shut down by striking workers, and spaceports were blocked off by protesters who didn't quite seem to be acting on their own volition. In response, the planetary governors were forced to deploy the Steel Legion en masse to put down the unexpected opposition, who were thankfully rather swift in their retaliatory actions. The hives within the region of Armageddon Secundus were put to heal relatively quickly. However, within the region of Armageddon Primus, the cities were separated by vast mountainous regions, which led to a protracted campaign against the rebels, who were able to recoup their losses in the time that it took for the Steel Legion to navigate the rough terrain. The Lords sent news of this uprising to the wider Imperium, but it was decreed that no additional support would be sent to aid in their campaign. The Steel Legion and planetary defense forces were seen as being more than capable enough to put down the upstarts, and so the Imperial commanders felt that it was unnecessary to shore up their ranks. The disarray occupied the minds of near every person upon Armageddon, and so, whilst looking inwards to curtail their own rebellion, they were blind to the sudden emergence of the chaotic fleet within their system. Reality itself contorted and vomited forth the corrupted space hulk, known as the Devourer of Stars, along with hundreds of lesser vessels in high orbit above Armageddon. The scions of the Dark Gods were quick to turn their weapons batteries towards the surface of this soon-to-be damned world. The silence of the void was cut by the cacophonous booming of macro cannons and melter torpedoes, bringing with them a level of destruction not seen upon Armageddon since the days of the Ulanor Crusade. Bastions were leveled to the ground, buried beneath the sheer weight of ordnance, ceaselessly pounding them into the ashen dirt. Behind this maelstrom came the first of the dread claw drop pods. Slamming down, their great spiked legs bit deeply into the earth, only to burst open, revealing the first of the frenzied world eaters, desperate to drown the doomed planet in a boiling sea of blood. Behind them were the disgusting dregs of humanity who had sold their souls to chaos in the damnable pursuit of tainted power. Cultists appeared, setting up ritualistic circles, chanting their praises to Khorne, and from their infernal song came the legions of the Blood God, rabidly cleaving apart any mortals in sight, with a swift slice of their hellblades. Unfortunately, their invasion triggered the latent madness within the greater population to finally break out into an all-out rebellion. Around half of the deployed planetary defense force were swept up by the chaotic wave and turned their arms upon their kin, falling in line with the larger traitor armies in the hopes that their treachery would garner them some form of favor with the Lord of Skulls. As you can probably guess, this sudden invasion, comprised of the preemptive bombardment, chaotic deployment, and of the betrayal of the PDF, caught the defenders of Armageddon completely off guard. After but one short week, millions of innocents had been put to the slaughter, butchered beyond all comprehension by the scions of Khorne. The flesh of the fallen was burnt away by the cultists, only so that they may retrieve their cracked skulls, which were then erected into a colossal effigy amidst a pool of imperial blood. With the utterance of an ancient, long-forgotten ritual, their bones began to hum with an otherworldly energy, until finally, at long last, they exploded in a horrific spray of gore. From that torrent of blood walked the warlord of this invasion, and it was none other than of the Red Prince, Angron. Once, he had been a man, nay, a child of the Emperor, but those days were long since past, and he now stood as a demon primarch to Khorne, eternally locked in a state of undying rage, and he was fully prepared to shatter this world and condemn all life upon it to the chaos of the warp. With Angron now at their head, the traitor forces swept across Armageddon, leveling entire districts of the towering hive cities and putting the desperate inhabitants to the sword wherever they were to be found. There was little the defenders could do other than flee. Though they made a valiant effort, the Steel Legion were ill-prepared to banish a demon primarch, and so they were forced to retreat from the more developed region of Armageddon Primus through the equatorial jungle to find refuge within the sparser territories of Armageddon Secundus. But truly, if the chaotic devastation continued at its current rate, then it would seem as though their efforts would be utterly futile. For how could they possibly contend with the relentless warbands now charging through to claim the world, with the Red Angel at their head? Armageddon had at this point fallen from its previous state as a peaceful hive world into a waking nightmare. The forces of chaos were everywhere. No place was safe from the insidious reaches of the cultists, eager to spill blood in the name of their patron god, and to summon forth new demonic horrors, the likes of which would bring only further ruin to the already damned world. But within the ashen plains of Armageddon Secundus, all hope was not yet lost. The surviving guardsmen of the Steel Legion had joined forces with the rest of their regiments and were positioning themselves to prevent the followers of Khorne from encroaching deeper into their territories. But before resigning themselves to death, their commanders sent out into the void a desperate call for aid. Though their vox was heavily dampened by the raging warp activity above, their prayers were finally heard by a chapter of the Emperor's own angels, the Space Wolves. The Sons of Russ had been stationed within the local sector, and upon hearing of this invasion, their chapter master Logan Grimnar assembled his great company to descend and purge this world of its chaotic taint once and for all. Though it would still take them weeks to reach Armageddon, the corrupted warbands upon the field had somewhat relented in their attack. Angron had not yet passed through the dense jungles, choosing instead to desecrate the conquered hive cities of Armageddon Prime, twisting them into nightmarish monuments to Khorne, making them appear as great iron volcanoes, erupting with the blood of the innocent Imperials. In time, however, the Red Angel grew restless in his worship, and so, with a mighty roar, he assembled the traitor forces to charge through the equatorial jungle and to bring death to Armageddon's Secundus. As he emerged from the tangle, he expected to find the pathetic ragtag survivors of the prior attack, but this was certainly not to be the case. Instead, the Steel Legion had erected a vast defensive network, manned not only by the stalwart members of the Guard, but also by the indomitable bands of the Space Wolves. Enraged, he ordered for the traitors to attack, and yet, even with their strength, there was simply no way to break the steel-clad Imperial lines. Khorne berserkers could scarcely cross the deathly no-man's land, being blown apart under the weight of Imperial artillery and precise bursts of fire from the guardsmen. The feral demon engines, including defilers, blood slaughterers, and brass scorpions, tried as they might, found their spiked legs to simply sink into the blasted ashen mud, where they writhed and screeched out in hellish wails before finally being put down by the thunderous lasers of a super-heavy Shadow Sword tank. An important point to note here is that when the fleets of Chaos first arrived within the Armageddon sector, that they had not only brought with them the chaotic legions, but also a colossal, occlusive warp storm. This rift had spread out to ensnare the doomed world in its infernal swell. And yet it was not constant in its power. At times it would grow in size, and as the barrier between our realm and the warp weakened, the Chaos forces would be empowered, allowing them to more effortlessly push forward, bolstered by the foul touch of the Immaterium. But sometimes it would wane. When this storm retracted, the demons could no longer anchor themselves to this world, making it far easier for the Imperials to respond and banish them back into the hellscape of the warp. Thankfully, during this rather pivotal battle, the warp storm had calmed to an unprecedented level, and in this moment of weakness, the Steel Legion and Space Wolves were given the chance to attack. Logan Grimnar, the old Wolf of Fenris, personally led his great company and guardsman allies on a heroic charge from their defensive line, hoping to shatter the chaotic offensive once and for all. They were outnumbered by a factor of 1,000, but it simply did not matter. Pushing across the scarred earth, they crashed into the faltering warband, rending the pathetic cultists apart with sword and fang. This attack had been so overwhelming that they were successful in forcing the heretics to pull back into the equatorial jungle. But it was here, along the banks of the river Cheren and Styx, that the battle turned into a slaughter. On the banks of each river, the two sides set up new defensive fortifications before unleashing their salvos of las and bolter fire into one another. The air itself took on a dark grey tinge from the sheer volume, and this only grew thicker as the loyalist Leman Russ tanks and traitor predators joined to support their sides. But the boiling rage of the Khornate followers and the retributive fury of the Space Wolves could not be contained by a mere ranged battle. Scarcely an hour had passed before the Marines vaulted over their respective lines and charged into the river to engage in the glorious dance of melee. Squads of grey hunters crashed into the frenzied berserkers, chain blades locking up as their teeth seized into dense flesh and bone, causing some Marines to simply drop their weapons and fall into one another in a deathly brawl. The forces who remained upon the banks turned their arms down towards the river, hoping to aid their allies by picking off enemies wherever they could be seen. Whilst the Imperials took a great deal of care to avoid shooting into melee, the same could not be said for the servants of the ruinous powers. Squads of havocs fired haphazardly into the great swarms beneath them, caring not for the Khornate scions who they felled. The flowing river, once clear and pristine, was now stained with the deep, tinge of blood. But this sight only pushed the traitors into an ever more furious rage. Though the Imperial defense line was holding steady, at the western reach of the River Styx, they were about to be met by a truly unstoppable force. Angron, the Red Angel, and his Crua Praetoria had joined in the fray. This was a group of 12 bloodthirsters, greater demons of Khorne, who had pledged their strength to Angron in the belief that their support would somehow garner them with a mote of favor from the Lord of Skulls. It was without warning that they emerged from the dense tangle, but in one brutal charge, they crashed through the Imperial lines, rending dozens of guardsmen apart with each swing of their demonic hellblades. Though stalwart, the combined forces of the Steel Legion and Space Wolves were forced to pull back and regroup within the plains of Armageddon Secundus, leaving the charred jungle to be engulfed in a new wave of blood and gore. With Angron now leading their warpath, the chaotic bands were set on a direct course towards the twin hive cities of Hellsreach and Infernus, and if these two were to fall, then it would almost certainly spell the doom of Armageddon. As the Loyalists regrouped around the base of these cities, it seemed as though their final battle was now upon them, and yet the old wolf had one final trick up his power-armored sleeve. As Armageddon faced its seemingly inevitable death within the hellish maw of Angron's forces, Logan Grimnar made a fated call, which would forever change the fate of both this world and of the Space Wolves themselves. In the weeks prior to this final stand, he had sent a desperate request for aid to the mysterious demon-hunting chapter of the Space Marines, named as the Grey Knights. Very few outside of the Inquisition, save for the Astartes chapter masters or High Lords, even knew of their existence. But perhaps this was for good reason. First formed in the climactic days of the Horus Heresy, they were to be humanity's final bulwark against the darkness of the warp, ever ready to stand as the unbreakable shield against all things demonic, to safeguard the Imperium, even if all other forces had failed. This was not the first time they had been summoned to a doomed world. And yet, rather strangely, even if they had been successful in their prior campaigns, none of the surviving Imperial citizens nor soldiers would ever have any memories of these fabled knights appearing. But in any case, upon the blasted fields which surrounded the Hive's Hellsreach and Infernus, the demon hunters had finally arrived. A task force of 109 knights had been deployed to Armageddon, leaving only a meager garrison of 18 left on their fortress monastery upon Titan, as the rest of the chapter had already been deployed for other missions throughout the galaxy. For a task as monumental as banishing a demon Primarch, they would need all the help they could get. But alas, the 109 who answered the call were now destined to clash with the Red Angel. In high orbit, within the black ships of their organization, were 30 presiding inquisitors, keen to watch over their work and to ensure that the demon lord Angron would be banished by any means necessary. Should the knights fail, then the only remaining option would be to order for an exterminatus. But for as long as the task force still lived, then Armageddon still had a chance to survive. The Marines who had been deployed were no mere interceptors nor purifiers. Nay, they were knights, clad in blessed Terminator armor. Their gauntlets were bolstered by storm bolters, but in their hands were a myriad of demon hammers, nemesis blades, and force glaives, all of which were perfectly honed towards the art of banishing the foul scions of the warp in whatever form they took. Rather than manifesting within the ranks of the surviving defenders, the knights had instead teleported themselves directly into the heart of the chaotic warband, surrounding Angron and his 12 bloodthirster companions. Witnessing the sudden appearance of these silver warriors, the space wolves let out a resounding howl, and similarly leapt from their posts, seeing this as their final opportunity to put down the chaotic taint once and for all. The newly reinvigorated Imperials crashed into the rapidly advancing warband, once again falling into the brutal and bloody carnage that can only come about from glorious melee combat. The death cries of loyalists and traitors alike could hardly be heard above the cacophonous sounds of artillery, still raining down a constant barrage of heavy ordnance across the entirety of the field. The leaden-toned earth, more akin now to the cratered surface of a moon, ran thick with mud and hot, oozing blood, forming dark trails as it ran into the deep impressions of tank treads and heavy boot prints. But still visible through the ghastly haze of battle was of the blazing impression of the Red Angel. Even as a mortal, the Primarch would have towered over all others, and yet now, ascended as a demon prince of Khorne, he was a walking effigy of death. His scarlet skin, bulging with molten veins, was barely enclosed by plates of warp-forged brass armor, which from his back had split open to reveal 2 colossal leathery wings pierced with chains, each ending with a trail of burning skulls. When he reared his frightful head to the skies, it was clear that every last trace of his humanity had been stolen away. No longer did he possess the face of a man, but the visage of an immaterial beast. His nose, stubby and bat-like, was flanked by 2 blazing eyes, casting out the baleful half-light of warp fire. That fanged maw of his had expanded to an impossible degree, gnashing and biting out at random, as if he sought to feast upon the mists of blood sprayed out from the untold thousands who lay dead at his feet. Spilling from the back of his head was the tangled mess of the butcher's nails, Nucerian archaeotech implanted directly into his demonic brain, magnifying even the smallest mote of subconscious anger into a truly incomparable rage. And yet, where had once been vacant earth, now stood the Terminators of the Grey Knights. Summoning their innate psychic strength, some sought to shackle the Lord of the Red Sands, yet they could never hope to subdue such a formidable foe. Raising his right arm, he brought down a great sweep with the black blade, effortlessly cleaving 5 of the demon hunters in twain. Where they fell, 10 more rushed to fill their place, unleashing a salvo of psi rounds from their storm bolters, yet they too were crushed and torn asunder by the rabid swings and strikes of Angron. The bloodletting was so glorious that the Cruor Praetoria was spurred into a greater frenzy, as though his endless rage had seemingly infected their immaterial essence. They too fell into the ranks of the knights, cleaving and hacking through their sublime armor, crushing them into the mud and reveling in this truly righteous act of slaughter. Yet, their attack could not break the secret chapter. Slowly, the bloodthirsters were brought low, their ankles and shins sliced open by precise cuts, causing them to stumble, at which point brother knights would leap forth with demon hammers to crush their hell-spawned heads into the dirt and to banish them to the nightmare of the warp. Angron, however, was truly relentless. He had already killed dozens of the knights, and in a moment of glory he stooped down and began to repeatedly pummel his sword against the faltering kine shield of a brother, known as Malkadale. With the 5th strike, the barrier was shattered, causing Mal to collapse into the mud, certain to meet his death in the next heartbeat. But that moment never came. As the Black Blade was brought down to execute this man, a most unexpected event occurred. Hyperion, another of the Grey Knights, unleashed a surge of psychic energy towards Angron, not aimed at the beast, but at the Black Blade. The colossal weapon was frozen in mid-air, prompting two other knights to throw their swords as though they were spears, piercing the demon's wrist and causing it to catch alight in holy flame. Then, reaching into his own soul, Hyperion channeled every last mote of energy he had into the hovering blade, causing it to first shudder and then crack. In an otherworldly explosion, the sword shattered into 1,000,000 pieces of black bronze, sent screaming across the field in a burst so large that the entire battle was forced to pause for but the briefest of moments. Hyperion, his life force spent, fell to his knees, but Angron was now left defenseless. A captain of the Grey Knights, named as Taramar Aurelian, marched forward, and after issuing a fated challenge, he charged to duel with the fallen angel. In but a swift motion, he charged and leapt up, planting his own forceglaive deep into the blackened heart of Angron, committing his soul to once more be banished into the hellscape of the warp. But as the beast fell to the grounds below, he lashed out in his own endless fury, dealing a mortal blow to the heroic knight who bested him. In his final moments, Angron gazed into his eyes and spoke, stating that whilst he would be reborn, that Taramar's soul would be pulled into the immaterium to be devoured by demons until the end of time. But as the fallen angel was engulfed by a rising storm of warp fire, it seemed as though the battle had reached a turning point. With the death of Angron, the surviving elements of the Chaos Warband were left leaderless, prompting a second wave of Space Wolves and Steel Legionaries to rush forth, finally purging Armageddon from its taint until it could once again be pure and safe. In the end, as the Loyalists regrouped, only 13 of the original Grey Knights had survived. Yet from their sacrifice, it seemed as though Armageddon would live to see another day. Though the world was indeed safe, this was hardly the time for revelry and celebration. The twin hives of Hellsreach and Infernus stood tall, and yet the surrounding grounds beneath them were now blasted open, revealing only a ruined vista, stained with the dark bloods of loyalist and traitor alike. To walk in the wake of this war zone, we would find naught but the dead. Tens of thousands of guardsmen, once proud members of the Steel Legion, now lay half-buried beneath the singed mud. The striking blue armor panels of Space Wolves could be seen strewn about, being the only true source of color to be found in this new vista of death. Thankfully, however, the majority of the bodies were comprised of the countless numbers of traitors who had descended to claim Armageddon for their own dark masters. It would be impossible to estimate their losses, but stretched out from the equatorial jungle was a veritable ocean of the dead, punctuated by ruined vehicles and even of great titans brought low under the weight of Steel Legion fire. But there, in one region of the field, lit by a single piercing ray of starlight, were the bodies of the fallen Grey Knights. They had died a martyr's death, and yet all that was left of them was of their tarnished silver helms jutting out from the burning pools of Angron's unholy blood. To return to the living, however, the remaining survivors moved to regroup, partly to lick their wounds, but mainly to set out their plans for restoring Armageddon to its old state of peace and order. There were no more of the servants of chaos to be hunted down, but their effigies still stood tall across Armageddon Primus. Thus, the initial plan would be to set out to scour the world of any remaining traces of chaos before finally rebuilding that which had been brought to ruin. The Steel Legion and Space Wolf forces were eager to begin, but if we were to look above them, through the clouds and into high orbit, we would find the dreaded ships of the Inquisition still hovering and waiting for their moment to intervene. The Inquisitors, though pleased with the news that Angron had been defeated, understood that this war was not over, and that only they could be trusted with the arduous task of cleansing the ashes, lest the well-intentioned souls of the ignorant fall to corruption. They also knew that a significant portion of this purification process would invariably involve the surviving civilians and Imperial Guardsmen. They had been exposed to the unbridled madness of the warp, forced to witness secrets most forbidden, and for this crime there could be no redemption. The fate of Armageddon came down to a vote, held between the 30 Inquisitors, where they resoundingly agreed that in this situation that there was no such thing as innocence, only degrees of guilt. And so, without remorse nor concern, they agreed to condemn the entire human populace below. Some cities had been completely untouched by the flames of war, and yet the hundreds of millions of Imperials who dwelled within would be sentenced to the same fate, and removed from this world as though they were a foul plague. But to the Inquisition, this was a necessary evil. None could know of the existence of chaos, and so their deaths, though cruel, would shield the meek souls of the Imperium from learning of our greatest enemy. Some of the more radical of Inquisitors sought to quell all chances of corruption and to order for an exterminatus, yet this world was simply too valuable to lose, and so rather than sentencing it to death, it would simply be wiped clean and reseeded for the glory of all mankind. Before the Great Purge could begin, the 13 surviving Grey Knights were summoned back to their ships, partly to heal, but primarily to keep their existence as another of the Inquisition's most prized of secrets. As they teleported away, and as the smokes cleared, the Lord Inquisitor Gesmi Kisnaros gave the order for the Purge of Armageddon to begin. Stormtroopers were deployed en masse to round up the surviving civilians from their cities under the false guise that their homes needed to be cleaned and sterilized from the prior carnage. But in truth, this was but a lie. They were instead shuttled into transportations and convoyed off to the sprawling labor camps built out in the wastelands of Armageddon, where they would be personally dealt with by the Inquisition. The Space Wolves were quick to understand what was happening, yet they could do little but provide refuge for small portions of the populace, whilst painfully watching that which they could not fully prevent. Once within the work camps, all would be ordered to receive an injection, touted as a medicine, which in actual fact would sterilize them. From here, they were to be shuttled away to isolated labor sites, controlled by the Inquisition, so that they could live out the rest of their short lives while under the constant watch of agents who would mercilessly strike at even the smallest sign of corruption. The inhumanity of the Inquisition only continued when they turned to the survivors of the Steel Legion. Those who had fought upon Armageddon were informed that they had been called upon to intervene in a distant war zone, found out in the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Stoic as ever, they took no pause and honored their directives, though tragically this would be the last order they ever followed. As their ships entered into orbit, the inquisitorial fleets opened fire, blasting them out of the sky, ensuring that not a single guardsman would ever live to tell of their tales in doing battle with the Red Angel. The Space Wolves were blindsided by this attack. They knew that it was an option for the Inquisition, yet believed that, due to the gravity of the conflict below, that a compromise could be reached. But now, witnessing the vessels of the Imperial Guard being blown to smithereens, they were forced to once again intervene. The Fenrisian fleet moved to shield the many vessels of the Steel Legion, and though they did not return fire, their presence did permit a scant few of the Imperial Guard vessels to drop into the warp and flee from this region. At this point, the remaining fleets of the Wolves exited from warp travel to bolster their brothers over Armageddon, finally providing the Astartes with the upper hand over the Inquisition. But the world below was now purged, and so the Inquisitors had no reason to remain. Instead, the combined fleets of the Inquisition and Grey Knights slipped into the warp to hunt down the guardsmen who had managed to escape. Rather tragically, the Inquisitors were successful in locating the surviving guardsmen held upon several worlds, which were all to be put to the torch and destroyed by an order of exterminatus. Condemning these worlds to ruin was indeed harsh, but this act had been performed simply to prove a point to the Space Wolves that their hubris and intervention would only lead to further death on a truly unprecedented scale. But with this, the Wolves could no longer trust in the judgment of the Inquisition, and in fact it seemed as though a civil war had begun to brew. In the following weeks, the Space Wolves continued in their mission of escorting any survivors off-world, retrieving some from their hidden refuges on Armageddon, or by escorting further vessels which escaped from the eyes of the Inquisition. Each time, however, the dreaded black ships would descend, either to fire upon the condemned citizens or to ravage the world upon which they sought their salvation. During this conflict, the Inquisitors were increasingly comfortable with firing on the ships of the Space Wolves, caring not for the fact that they were inciting the ire of Fenris all the while. The Wolves, however, never returned fire, as they understood that it would invariably lead to their condemnation as renegades, permitting the Inquisitors to put their entire chapter to the flame. By this point, billions had died, many from Armageddon, but many more from the purging of the surrounding worlds. Perhaps if the Wolves had simply retreated, with their tails between their legs, and allowed the Inquisition to perform their duties, then these other worlds would have been spared. But alas, it is not in the nature of a wolf to flee when in the face of confrontation. As the weeks dragged into months, their struggle seemed to have grown stale, and eventually a parley was agreed to, held between the old wolf Logan Grimnar, Lord Inquisitor Gesme Kisnaros, and of the Grand Master of the Grey Knights, Joros. They were to meet in a neutral region, to discuss the terms which would end the needless slaughter of Imperial citizens, and to calm the relations between the two factions. Unfortunately, however, as soon as Logan Grimnar's vessel dropped out from warp travel, the Grey Knights opened fire, destroying 4 of the Wolves' ships, whilst crippling their great flagship. At this point, the Lord Inquisitor Kisnaros sent a Vox Hail, ordering the old wolf to teleport onto his own vessel to discuss the terms of his surrender, with the guarantee of death should he possibly refuse. Reluctantly, Logan Grimnar, along with 3 of his wolf guard, materialized within the teleportarium of the inquisitorial vessel and moved to stand against this bloated task force of Inquisitors, Grey Knights, and Stormtroopers alike. Though the Lord Inquisitor once more demanded for his surrender, the old wolf had never intended to follow through with his promise, and so lashed out, slaying Joros, the Grand Master of the Grey Knights, in a single slash before teleporting back to his own craft. From this, the civil war had truly begun. The wolves would no longer hold back, and for the next 7 months, they were seen to be openly engaging with and destroying any inquisitorial or Grey Knights vessels which were to be encountered. Such insolence, however, could not be forgiven. Lord Inquisitor Kisnaros drafted up his ultimatum, seeking to bring the fury of the Inquisition directly to the homeworld of the Space Wolves, Fenris. This could not be done alone, and so he summoned for a fully crewed battle fleet of the Imperial Navy, along with the entire chapter of the Red Hunters, Marines who were fiercely loyal to the Inquisition above all else. With this, the great assemblage slipped into the chaos of the warp and made route to the Wolf's Den. The hunt for the human survivors of the first war for Armageddon was over, but the scouring of Fenris now seemed imminent. The world was a sprawling wasteland of ice and snow, pocked by the ancient scars of war, bordered by wounds so great that they could have only been left by the raging storms and volcanoes which have come to define this hostile realm. Though it was now surrounded by the fleets of the Imperial Armada, all was not well within the inquisitorial ranks. It is said that the Lord Inquisitor Kisnaros did truly lament on the lives of those who had died during this conflict, and that he never intended for it to blossom to such a scale. Further, he understood that the Grey Knights had grown weary, and were now unwilling to join in this battle against a loyalist firstborn chapter. One amidst their ranks, the blade-breaker Hyperion, who had aided in slaying Angron back on Armageddon, was even contemplating with the idea of assassinating the Lord Inquisitor, simply to put an end to the rapidly approaching war. Thus, to avoid any more bloodshed, Kisnaros agreed to meet with a representative for the Wolves, atop their fortress monastery of the Fang. Upon their landing pad, jutting through the dense cloud layer, the inquisitorial retinue could do little but bask as the ancient dreadnought, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, emerged to discuss their terms. He was the oldest living Marine to be found across the Imperium, with his combat records dating back to the Horus Heresy and Great Crusade, where he fought side by side with both Leman Russ and with the Emperor himself. Though the inquisitorial agents were left somewhat speechless by his presence, Kisnaros managed to stammer out an offer, claiming that if the Wolves were to leave on a century-long, penitent crusade, that their deeds would be forgiven, and the records wiped clean. Naturally, Bjorn rejected this offer, claiming that the Inquisition had failed to appropriately serve the Imperium, and that their appeasement would simply ring hollow across the galaxy. Before Kisnaros could retort, the entirety of the Space Wolves fleet, led by Logan Grimnar, dropped into orbit around Fenris, only to be met by the Inquisitorial Armada, guns aimed at their homeworld. The Inquisitorial party teleported back into their own flagship, as this time there could be no more negotiations and no more delay, for the Wolves had not come to bargain, but to fight. Most void wars are fought across relatively enormous distances. However, this time, from their orbital position, the two fleets could do little but crash directly into one another. Ancient vessels, first constructed during a time long before the Great Crusade, were rammed by assault crafts, burrowing deep into their hulls before deploying small boarding parties to sabotage and generally bring havoc to the enemy crews. With the wolves already upon them, Kisneros ordered for half of their fleet to target the fortress monastery below with a ceaseless bombardment. Yet, rather strangely, he forbade the use of more destructive shells such as cyclonic torpedoes, instead only permitting traditional and more precise bombs to be fired. Perhaps he had been so awestruck by his meeting with Bjorn that he no longer wished to utterly exterminate the wolves. Yet it mattered not, for at that moment he was blinded by the flash of a teleporter, which, as it faded, revealed the sprinting outline of an Astartes Terminator. The chapter master, Logan Grimnar, had appeared within the confines of his command deck, and in one swift, brutal strike, the old wolf decapitated Lord Inquisitor Kisneros, leaving his body to slump lifelessly to the cold metal floors. Carnage erupted, with more and more of the wolves teleporting aboard to tear apart the ragged and fleeing survivors within. The Grey Knight, known as Hyperion to his brothers and Bladebreaker to the wolves, launched himself into a duel with Grimnar. The two became locked in a stalemate, but as his eyes began to bleed with the roiling warp fire of his soul, it seemed as though their battle would be forced to take pause. With another blinding flash of light, another figure had entered into the fray, yet he was not here for combat, but to talk. As the smoke faded, and as his presence became clearer, the wolves, acting in unison, dropped to their knees and ceased in their wanton bloodshed. Bjorn, the Fell-Handed, had materialized within the deck, aiming to finally put an end to this conflict and to speak some sense into the hot-blooded wolves who so desperately sought vengeance. The ancient dreadnought spoke of the ruin brought to Fenris and ordered for the great war howls of the wolves to be quieted, for nothing more could be gained from further acts of death. Turning to one of the surviving inquisitors, he stated that they may depart in peace, but that if any inquisitorial vessels ever return to Fenris, that they will be destroyed without mercy nor pity. The final demand was to Hyperion. Bjorn wished for him to walk through the halls of the Fang and to tell of the forbidden tales of the Grey Knights to their surviving brothers, as from their battle they deserved to know of each other's secrets, no matter how dark they may be. As he moved within the ruined fortress monastery, he looked up through the shattered ceilings to see the intact vessels of each fleet slowly departing and vanishing amidst the stars, destined to reach some far-off station to recover from this terrible ordeal. But with this, it seemed as though the horrific aftermath to the First War for Armageddon had finally come to an end. In the years which followed the banishment of Angron, billions of innocent humans were purged from Armageddon, only to be replaced by forcibly resettled citizens stolen from distant worlds across the Imperium. The planets which had been sentenced to death via an exterminatus. Each harbored the ashen, forgotten graves of billions more. And so we truly must ask, was this worth it? Who can truly know as to whether or not the taint of chaos will corrupt all that it touches? But to the Inquisition they cannot take such risks, and so death is to be the only mercy for one who has gazed into the warp, even if it was for but the briefest moment. We will never know if their purge ended up saving more lives than it cost, but what we do know is that neither side will forgive nor forget the involvement of the other. In the aftermath of their ceasefire, some of the surviving Inquisitors pondered on how they could possibly enact their revenge upon Fenris. Some agreed that if the world was to ever come under siege, that they would do everything within their power to prevent reinforcements from coming to their salvation. Others speculated on how they could tamper with or exploit the sacred gene seed of their chapter, along with other schemes which are undeniably most distasteful. The Grey Knights had been dealt an irreparable wound from participating in this war, and yet there were many within their ranks who sought to move past this conflict and to leave the wolves to their own devices. The demon hunters had lost over 100 of their irreplaceable marines, along with several ancient warships, and the invaluable contents held within. Truly, it would take them centuries to recoup from their losses, but the bell of lost souls was to toll for those who fell, venerating their names for the final time. The wolves, however, were left to tend to their wounds in the bitter cold. They could not forget the sheer death witnessed at the hands of those who were pledged to safeguard humanity, and of the lengths that they would go to in fulfilling their twisted notions of purity. Their fortress monastery of the Fang had been blasted apart by the inquisitorial bombardment, and many of their own brothers had needlessly died over the long months of shame. But as the ancient dreadnought, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, was powered down into lonesome hibernation, he uttered out that the Inquisition would ever be watching, and that if the skies of Fenris are to ever darken again, that they must simply howl out, and he will return to walk again. With this, my dearest friends, we have come to our end. Thank you for listening to this tale on the first war for Armageddon in its entirety. But I must now depart. As I close this chapter once more, I will wish you all with a warm goodbye.
Once again, big thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and remember that new or returning players who haven't played in 6 months on PC or console will get access to a massive bonus pack, giving you premium vehicles, 100,000 silver lions, decorators, and 7 days of a premium account. The links are found in the description and pinned comment below, so be sure to check them out. And as always, thank you for watching.